Most eschatologies, that is, most end time timelines, and everybody's got one. Okay, anybody who studies end times has their version of a timeline, and almost every single one of them, almost every single one that treats Revelation as future prophecy, believes in and has as a foundation for their eschatology a 7-year tribulation. And I don't care if you have a pre-tribulation rapture scenario where people are caught out before 7 years of trouble begins, or if you're a mid-trib person that you believe there's a rapture at the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation. I don't care if you're pre-wrath, you still believe in a 7-year tribulation. And if you're post-trib, you believe in a 7-year tribulation. There is no 7-year tribulation. The only time that I ever set a date was for a rapture in, I think it was 2020. And I was basing my understanding on a 7-year tribulation. So when the date came and went, and there was no rapture, I went back to the drawing board and I decided to look at everything that I had been taught, every assumption that I had about the end times. And the first thing I did was I tried to research a biblical basis, any kind of verses, anything that would prove a 7-year tribulation. And I couldn't find one verse, not one verse. But everybody who wanted to talk about a 7-year tribulation automatically went to Daniel chapter 9. And I've done several videos, a couple of video series on this passage in Daniel, but I am going to actually put the nail in the coffin for a 7-year tribulation. Anybody who thinks that they can wiggle out of what I'm saying today, I hope you'll contact me, because I always want to be, if I'm wrong, I want to know. I would rather know sooner rather than later. But let's take a look at what I've got here today. There's several reasons for this 70 weeks of years that this prophecy that Daniel receives from the angel Gabriel. Verse 24 tells us what is supposed to happen during these 70 weeks of years. 70 weeks of years are decreed concerning your people, that is the Jews, your holy city, that is Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophecy, or vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place or most holy one. During the course of 70 weeks of years, God is going to put an end to sin through some means, and iniquity is going to be atoned for. There's going to be atonement for iniquity for the Jews. All right, let me sort of draw out for you how most people view this 70 weeks of years. So the 70 weeks of years starts with a decree to rebuild the city. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. This is talking about the coming of the Messiah, that there would be a decree. Okay, so let's just put that in here. There was a decree that went out to rebuild the city. The Jews went back after their Babylonian captivity and they rebuilt the city. And there was going to be 69 weeks of years between the decree and the coming of an anointed one. Okay, a Messiah. So there are 7 weeks of years and there are 62 weeks of years. Okay, adding up to 69. This prophecy was meant to be understood by the people in Jesus' day so that they would be able to calculate from the decree to when Messiah would come. Okay, so you've got a decree, you've got 7 weeks plus 62 weeks is 69 weeks of years. Messiah would come at the end of that time. And then what most people do who believe in a 7-year tribulation, they believe that the Messiah arrived on Palm Sunday. Where they get this is from a book called The Coming Prince. Sir Robert Anderson wrote this book over 100 years ago, and he made these calculations in his way of how he wanted to do the math for this, between this decree that went out from Artaxerxes and, adding up how many weeks of years, and you get to the days and so on and so forth. And he arrived at Palm Sunday in a certain year. Can't remember. Okay, so that would be when people say the Messiah, Christ, showed up as king on Palm Sunday. And then after the 69 weeks, after Palm Sunday, Jesus died. He died, he rose again, but it was after the 69 weeks, okay? And it was somewhere in this gap, okay? There's a gap of time then that Jesus' death and his resurrection takes place in this gap of time. So in other words, Jesus' death is not part of the 69 weeks of years, okay? He shows up on Palm Sunday, that's the end of the 69 weeks. Then he dies and resurrects in this time gap, okay? And there's also 2,000 years of church history or whatever. And then the 70th week is going to begin over here with the Antichrist signing a covenant, okay? So this is 7 years long. And it's divided into 3.5 years and 3.5 years. And what people say is the Antichrist comes to power here. He authorizes the temple being rebuilt and so on. He makes a covenant with Israel. There's 3.5 years of stuff that happens. The rapture would have already happened too, somewhere in here. If you're pre-trib, it's prior to the Antichrist coming into power. If you're mid-trib, it would be right around here at this midpoint, which is the abomination of desolation. And if you're post-trib, it would happen here at the end of the second coming. All right, so the 70th week is divided into 2 parts, okay? That's how that works. And the first part of this 7 years, the Antichrist signs a covenant. It's broken in the middle. That's when the abomination happens. And then there's 3.5 years of what they would call Great Tribulation. Okay, so you got regular tribulation, the first 3.5 years, and Great Tribulation during the last 3.5 years. And this is all for Israel. But I want you to notice something here. This is the point I want to make. Is the purpose for the 70 weeks was to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity. Okay, so how was God going to put an end to sin and atone for iniquity? Right, there's only one right answer for that, and that is through Christ's death on the cross. There is no other way to put an end to sin or to atone for iniquity. That is it. Christ's death on the cross and his resurrection. Christ's death and resurrection are a part of the 70 weeks of years. The 70 weeks of years are to bring an end to sin and to atone for iniquity. Right here, if you have Jesus dying in a gap, his death and resurrection is not part of the 70 weeks. It's somewhere lost in space. And it isn't a part of the 70 weeks, but the Bible tells us that it is a part of the 70 weeks. So how are we supposed to understand the 70 weeks of Daniel? It's not hard, people. It's not hard. Okay, we've got a decree. Same thing. Decree goes out from Artaxerxes, and between the decree and Messiah the Prince, there's 69 weeks of years. So there's going to be 69 weeks of years. That is, 69 weeks of years are going to end, and a 70th week is going to begin. And then the passage tells us that after the 69 weeks of years, Messiah would be cut off. Okay, he's not cut off in a gap. He's cut off into the 70th week. He's cut off in the 70th week. Right here, Jesus has a 3.5 year ministry, and then he is cut off after the 69 weeks of years. It's in the midst of the 70th week that Messiah is cut off. We're not falling into a gap here. What we are is we're going into the 70th week. Okay, Messiah is going to be cut off. He is going to be killed. He's going to die as part of the purpose for the 70 weeks of years. It has to be in the time frame. You can't throw it in a gap. Jesus' death and resurrection has to be found somewhere in the 70 years. Let's take a look at verse 27. He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. Okay, so that's 7 years. He's going to make a strong covenant with the nation of Israel for 7 years. The grammar actually takes us back to Messiah the Prince. I've done whole videos on that, and I'm not going to cover that in this video. But the he will make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause sacrifice and offering to cease. Okay, when Christ died on the cross, he was the fulfillment of all Old Testament sacrifices and offerings. They were no longer necessary. The veil in the temple split in half. It tore in half, signifying that the way to God was now open. And the book of Hebrews tells us that it was through the veil of the flesh of Jesus. His atoning work for sin and iniquity is part of the 70 weeks. You can't throw it in a gap. And the grammar of the passage actually allows for this to happen, for Messiah the Prince to come. And he makes a covenant with many for 7 years, and we'll get into the last 3.5 years in a minute. He makes a covenant for 7 years. And in the midst of the week, he puts an end to sacrifice and offering. Here's where the gap happens. It's in the word and. This is where the gap is. We have, about 2,000 years here. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate. Okay, now in the King James Bible, it will say he, but that's not a good translation. No other translation translates it that way. Go look at Bible Hub or any other, good new translation. The word he is not referring back to this person here. It's one, somebody, some random person is going to come on the wing of abominations. All right, that's the last 3.5 years. And there are many, many, many passages that talk about 3.5 year reign of the beast, times and half a time, 42 months. There's many passages that talk about this right here. And then Jesus returns, pours out the decreed end on the desolator. That's the Antichrist here. So the last 3.5 years also deals with the nation of Israel. What is Christ going to do on the day of the abomination of desolation? Because his covenant is with Israel, okay? The first 3.5 years were in the first century at his first coming. At his second coming, he's going to be dealing with Israel again. But it's for the last 3.5 years. What happens? At the time of the abomination of desolation, that is when Jesus is going to come and lead the remnant of Israel into the wilderness. Okay, for 1,260 days or 3.5 years, he's going to lead them into the wilderness. Revelation 12, Matthew 24 talks about the abomination of desolation, and the Jews, when they see that, they have to flee into the wilderness. And it says that as lightning flashes from the east to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be in his day. That's the coming right here. When Jesus comes for the remnant of Israel to lead them into the wilderness. This is Zechariah chapter 14, that Jesus comes to the Mount of Olives. There's an earthquake, the mountain splits, and he leads the remnant into the wilderness. This is when lightning flashes from the east to the west. It's very quick. He comes, and in probably less than an hour, he's got the people he's going to be taking into the wilderness for 1,260 days, and thus fulfilling the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. So anybody who says that you can prove a 7-year tribulation from Daniel chapter 9 needs to show me where in this scenario Christ is putting an end to sin and atoning for iniquity. As far as I'm concerned, he has to do that within the 70 weeks. He did it at his first coming. And here is something else. There's been other calculations from the decree until the coming of the Messiah, the Prince, that don't land you on Palm Sunday. In fact, there are other people who've done the math and the calculations, and it lands 3.5 years earlier during the fall feast. And some people say it's in the year 28 or 27 AD. Okay, this would be it would fit perfectly in with the scenario. And, okay, this is when John the Baptist showed up and said, prepare the way of the Lord. He's the forerunner for the Messiah. So the Messiah, the Prince, had to have a forerunner. That's John the Baptist appearing at the fall feast saying, prepare the way of the Lord. Jesus is coming. And there were people who immediately upon seeing Jesus, like Nathanael, said, you are the King of Israel. John chapter 2, verse 47. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said of him, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile. And Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? And Jesus said to him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. And Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. So Jesus was being declared King of Israel before Palm Sunday, long before Palm Sunday, right at the beginning of the fall feast, right around the time of his baptism. That's when Messiah showed up. And that's why the Jews went out to John and said, are you the Messiah? Are you the Christ? Are you the one that we're supposed to be watching for? Because they knew it would be during the fall feast. They knew that. And Jesus was baptized during the fall feast, and 3.5 years later at Passover, it was when he put an end to sacrifice and offering through his death on the cross. He put an end to sin. He made atonement for iniquity. It's part of the 70 weeks of years. All right, if you can show me where I'm wrong here, I hope you'll leave a comment in the comments section. Otherwise, I just debunked 7 years of tribulation. We'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.